Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, fluff the pillows, and take a slow breath. Tonight we're settling into something a little misty around the edges. Something soft and strange. We're wandering through the quiet corners of history again. The ones where royal portraits stare back with the expression of someone who definitely had secrets, or at the very least a tax problem. This time we're gliding through 5 of the most mysterious kings in world history. And by mysterious, I don't mean fun Sherlock Holmes mystery. I mean the slow burn sort where scholars squint for centuries, shrug and say, yeah, we still have no idea what this man was doing. So just relax, settle in, and let's drift backward in time. Our first royal enigma is a favorite among people who enjoy deciphering bizarre medieval riddles. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The dreamy, spending-addicted, swan-obsessed monarch who basically turned Bavaria into a theme park of architectural fever dreams. Let's float to the 19th century. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The moonlit monarch. Ludwig II was born in 1845, though personally, he seemed more emotionally connected to the medieval era than anything resembling his own century. You could drop this man into the year 1200 with a horse, a cape, and the vaguest understanding of chivalry, and he'd probably whisper, "Finally home." From early childhood, everyone noticed Ludwig had a certain ethereal quality. He wasn't dangerous or chaotic, just someone who stared out windows a lot. The kind of kid who'd be given a sword and asked to train for leadership, but he'd end up writing poems to the mountains instead. His tutors complained constantly that he wasn't paying attention, which frankly was the default setting for about 90% of European royalty. But Ludwig took it to an art form. He studied French religious dramas. He memorized medieval legends. He fell hopelessly in love with the music of Richard Wagner, a man who, for clarity, wrote operas that were basically 12-hour fantasies about doomed love triangles between mythic demigods who desperately needed therapy. And Ludwig ate it up like it was the emotional validation he'd been waiting for. When he became king at 18, everyone assumed he would grow out of the eccentricity. Spoiler, he absolutely did not. He leaned into it like a man sprinting down a hill with no intention of stopping. Almost immediately, Ludwig built a reputation for avoiding his own government. He didn't like politics. He didn't like meetings. He didn't like paperwork, people, or anything that involved being king in the responsible sense. Instead, he went full, I am the tragic romantic hero of this opera, which must have been refreshing in a very confusing way for Bavaria. His night owl habits. One of Ludwig's lesser-known quirks, but one of my favorites, was his devotion to staying awake all night and sleeping through the day. Not because he was plotting political schemes or indulging in anything scandalous, but because he genuinely believed night was more beautiful, more peaceful, and more suited to kings who thought they were medieval saints reborn. His servants basically lived like exhausted bats, forced to adapt to the royal schedule, which often involved midnight carriage rides in the Alps, or late-night dinners where Ludwig would wax poetic about ancient sagas while staring sadly into candlelight. This was not a party king situation. This was brooding theatrical loner king energy. His architectural obsession. But of course, the main thing that made Ludwig truly mysterious and famously expensive was his obsession with building castles. Not functional castles. Not defensive castles. We're talking dreamscape castles. Architectural fan fiction brought to life. Neuschwanstein, the crown jewel of his imagination, looks like someone took every medieval fairy tale trope, put it in a blender, and poured it onto a Bavarian mountain. It's gorgeous, of course. It's also incredibly impractical. Even during construction, people whispered, "Why is he doing this?" followed by, "And how much is this costing us?" The answer was, a lot. A number so large it caused Ludwig's ministers to develop chronic headaches. His other projects, Linderhof Herrenchium C, were equally extravagant, each one a shrine to his daydreams. He filled rooms with gold leaf, mirrors, fountains, tapestries, and murals of heroic myths. It was like he was trying to physically live inside the world Wagner created, which is both poetic and financially catastrophic. Everyone kept waiting for Ludwig to calm down. He never did. His mysterious personal life. Now, the part that keeps historians awake, metaphorically, is the emotional mystery at the heart of Ludwig's life. He was engaged once to his cousin Sophie, but the engagement dissolved in a cloud of vague explanations and awkward royal letters. Ludwig insisted he loved her deeply, but in a platonic, idealized, vaguely medieval way that didn't seem to align with actually wanting to be married. In private diaries, he expressed deep turmoil about relationships, desire, shame, and faith. He was intensely religious, in the old-school guilt-heavy sense, and he struggled with his own identity, caught between what he felt and what he believed a king was supposed to be. You get the sense of a man always at war with himself, trapped between duty and longing, reality and fantasy. He withdrew further into his castles. He stopped speaking to people regularly. He communicated through letters, often refusing eye contact. Ministers began scheming, not out of cruelty but because they genuinely couldn't get hold of the man. Ludwig became a ghost king, present but unreachable. The strange end. And then, of course, there's the mystery of his death. The part that launched 1,000 conspiracy theories and late-night documentaries. In 1886, his ministers declared him insane, based largely on rumors, observations from afar, and the assumption that anyone who built that many castles had to be mentally unstable. It's worth noting that nobody actually examined him. They just agreed. He was deposed, taken into custody, and then, only days later, he was found dead in waist-deep water in Lake Starnberg beside his psychiatrist. To this day, no one knows what happened. There were no clear signs of struggle. There were no witnesses. There was no official explanation that made sense. Some said suicide, but Ludwig showed no signs of wanting to die. Some said murder. Others said an accident. Historians shrug, close their books, and mutter, "We still don't know." What we do know is that Ludwig remains one of history's softest, strangest, most romantic figures. A king who didn't want a kingdom, only beauty. Only dreams. Only the world inside his imagination. And so, as we slowly drift away from his candlelit halls and echoing corridors of impossible castles, we'll let the moonlit monarch rest. Let's quietly float to our next royal mystery, a man whose disappearance still confuses archaeologists and armchair conspiracy theorists to this day. King Sennacherib of Assyria, the vanishing architect of Nineveh. Now we drift far back, way back into the ancient world, to a place where kings didn't write moody diary entries or commission operas, because they were too busy building massive cities and brutally conquering neighbors. But tonight we're focusing on the soft, strange edges of these rulers. And ancient Assyria gives us one of history's earliest royal enigmas. King Sennacherib, the king who redesigned an entire capital city, and then died mysteriously in a temple after angering pretty much everyone. Sennacherib ruled from about 705 BCE to 681 BCE, during the peak of the Assyrian Empire, which was famous for being extremely good at war and extremely bad at public relations. These people carved victory propaganda into stone like it was their main hobby. Sennacherib, however, is remembered most not for war, although he did plenty of that, but for his architectural obsession with the city of Nineveh. This man went on what we might call a royal urban development spree, and rebuilt the whole place to his personal taste. If Ludwig II was the dreamer of fairy tale castles, Sennacherib was the ancient engineer who wanted water channels, lush gardens, and a palace so big it made everyone feel underdressed. The palaces and the gardens. Sennacherib's pride and joy was something he called the palace without rival. Very humble title. Completely normal. Just like naming your child, better than all other babies. The palace was massive. A sprawling complex full of rooms, courtyards, reliefs, gardens, and architectural features we're still discovering. He's also credited by some scholars with creating the original prototype of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Yes, those gardens. Though this is debated, the idea of him trying to build a giant, impossibly green paradise in the middle of a desert city tracks. Sennacherib wrote long, proud inscriptions about his irrigation systems, which honestly read a bit like an ancient engineer bragging on LinkedIn. But beneath this passion for urban beauty, there was something darker brewing. The mysterious death. Sennacherib's reign ended abruptly, and in a way that left historians quietly baffled for centuries. According to ancient texts, Sennacherib was assassinated by two of his own sons while praying inside a temple. This wasn't a quick palace coup. This was a deeply symbolic patricide, carried out in the holiest possible place, and likely tied to a complicated succession dispute that modern scholars still can't fully unravel. Why did his sons turn on him? Was it politics? Revenge? Jealousy? No one knows. All we have are fragments. And what happened to the guilty sons? They fled, vanishing into the mountains, leaving the throne to yet another brother, the one Sennacherib apparently didn't want as heir. The assassination was brutal, yes, but the mystery around the motives is what lingers. Even the ancient chroniclers couldn't fully explain it. This was rare for Assyria, a place where they wrote down everything from battles to crop yields to. By the way, this omen was weird today. The silence around his death is what makes it eerie. The missing body problem. There's also the fact that Sennacherib's body has never been found. Assyrian kings were usually buried with enormous ceremony, but no tomb has ever been confirmed as his. Some think the political fallout was too chaotic. Others think his unpopular religious reforms led his successors to bury him quietly, or even deny him a proper royal burial. So here's a king who redesigned a city, built one of the greatest palaces of his age, and left behind inscriptions bragging about his engineering prowess, only to vanish from the archaeological record like a ghost. Even his own monument, placed by later generations, is awkwardly vague. A king erased by his own children's conspiracy. Tomb lost to time. A death whispered, never explained. We glide slowly past the ruins of his vanished palace, and let the mystery settle like desert dust. And now, gently, we drift toward our next royal riddle. A king whose reign is wrapped in legends, half-truths, and one extremely inconvenient sword in a stone. Part 2: King Arthur. The maybe king who refused to stop being mysterious. Alright. Let's drift into one of history's foggiest corners. The kind where historians start arguing, archaeologists start sighing, and medieval poets start aggressively embellishing every possible detail. Tonight we float into the world of King Arthur. Or more accurately, a probably not actually named Arthur but maybe kind of was Arthur figure who lived somewhere between myth, politics, and ancient PR campaigns. Because Arthur is the ultimate mysterious king, the man who may have existed, may have ruled, may have led armies, or may have been a literary group project gone wildly out of control. So let's take a slow breath and wander into the fog. Arthur, a king who might not have been a king. Here's the simplest way to understand Arthur. If Ludwig II was too dreamy to be a proper king, Arthur is too dreamy to be a proper person. The earliest mentions of a warrior named Arthur show up centuries after he supposedly lived. Not ideal for historical accuracy. The ancient Britons didn't exactly leave behind a lot of diaries, and the Romans were too busy collapsing to keep detailed notes. So the scholars do this thing, this deeply tired, mildly frustrated thing, where they gather around a table covered in fragments of 5th century texts, shrug in unison and say, "Look, something probably happened. Was there a real Arthur? Maybe. Was he a king? Maybe. Was he a charismatic warlord who fought Saxons and accidentally became a legend?" That's honestly our best bet. The story snowballed from there. Monks wrote about him, bards sang about him, poets invented plot twists for him, French authors added a bunch of romantic nonsense, and suddenly we had a man who wielded a magic sword, lived in a castle that probably didn't exist, and hung out with a wizard who definitely didn't. If Ludwig II blurred fantasy and reality, Arthur is the guy who created the genre. The sword problem. Of course we have to talk about the sword in the stone, that lovely mystical detail that may have started as a political metaphor and eventually became the golden ticket into medieval kingship. In some versions, Arthur pulls a sword from a stone because he's chosen by fate. In others, that sword is Excalibur, while in still others, Excalibur comes from the Lady of the Lake, because apparently the writers were brainstorming and said, not dramatic enough. Can we add a semi-immortal water spirit? Spoiler, yes, they could. The reality. Swords and stones did exist. Just not in the magical destiny chooses the rightful king kind of way. Sometimes ceremonial swords were stuck in stones at shrines. Sometimes leaders used the symbolism to show authority. But a teenage boy pulling one out because the universe said so? Very doubtful. But very fun. Camelot. The castle that refuses to behave. Camelot is a whole other mystery. Dozens of towns in Britain have claimed to be Camelot. Archaeologists politely smile, collect soil samples and quietly whisper, It's not Camelot. Please stop building gift shops around this. Camelot might have been inspired by a real fort or settlement, but it clearly grew into an exaggerated, glittering court full of equality, justice, and an alarming number of knights with questionable decision-making skills. Every century added new layers. More knights, more quests, more drama, more magical objects, more questionable romances. Looking at you, Lancelot and Guinevere. The legend behaved like a medieval snowball rolling downhill, collecting beauty, nonsense, and emotional damage along the way. Camelot became less a place and more an ideal. A dream of unity in a chaotic world. Something people wanted to believe existed. And honestly, that's its charm. Merlin. The wizard with the least historical chance of existing. Then we have Merlin, the man who could see the future, manipulate destiny, and occasionally act like a confused grandfather who forgot his own prophecies. Historically speaking, Merlin was stitched together from folklore, pagan traditions, and maybe one or two real bards with extremely dramatic reputations. If there was a real Merlin, he probably wasn't a wizard. At best, he was that one weird druid in the village who muttered ominous things to goats. But the medieval writers wanted magic, so they added magic. They wanted Arthur to shine, so they gifted him the most eccentric mentor possible. The result is a duo so iconic that the myth refuses to die. The moralizing medieval rewrite. What's fascinating is that the Arthurian legend was rewritten constantly. And each time, the writers nudged the story to match their own time period. Early versions. Arthur is a gritty war leader who smashes enemies. Pretty straightforward. Later versions. Arthur becomes a Christian role model with suspiciously perfect cheekbones, ruling a morally impeccable court run by knights who absolutely do not cheat on their wives. Until the French writers showed up and said, "Actually, we can fix that." By the High Middle Ages, Arthur wasn't even a king people believed in. He was the king people wished they had. The myth grew because it filled a need. People wanted hope. They wanted honor. They wanted a break from real-life rulers who were depressed, inbred, or losing battles in embarrassingly avoidable ways. Arthur was the fantasy antidote. Too good to be realistic. Too flawed to be boring. Too legendary to be fully explained. Which, of course, makes him one of the most mysterious kings in history. Because the mystery is whether he was even real to begin with. Let's drift to the Far East. We're staying in the realm of ambiguity for a bit longer, and this next king is a masterclass in historical uncertainty. A man whose entire existence is basically one long collective shrug from historians. Softly and slowly we travel to ancient Japan, to visit Emperor Jimmu, the first emperor of Japan, according to tradition, mythology, and a surprising amount of imperial propaganda. Emperor Jimmu, the divine maybe emperor of early Japan. Emperor Jimmu's story is less historical biography, and more divine origin story that got a little out of hand. He is traditionally said to have ascended the throne in 660 BCE, which is incredibly specific for someone whose life details read like a Shinto fairy tale. According to myth, Jimmu was a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, which, is always a promising start for a genealogy chart. It puts him right up there with other definitely embellished rulers like Romulus of Rome, who allegedly got raised by wolves, which historians politely translate as probably did not. The earliest written sources about Jimmu appear many centuries after he supposedly lived. So the gap between the actual events and the written record is large enough to drive a royal carriage through. The divine bloodline. Jimmu's story was heavily influenced by Japan's early imperial governments, who were very determined to show that their authority came straight from the gods, literally. Nothing says, "Please don't rebel," like claiming your family line is related to the sun. This divine connection became the backbone of Japanese imperial ideology for centuries. Even if Jimmu never existed as a literal historical figure, his myth shaped politics, religion, and national identity. But in terms of actual archaeology, we've got nothing. There are no confirmed tombs, palaces, weapons, or contemporary records describing him. The earliest sources, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, written in the 8th century, paint him as a flawless, divinely guided ruler, which is usually historian speak for, "Okay, so this definitely did not happen like that." The Journey East. One of Jimmu's most famous legends involves a long eastward journey through Japan, fighting tribes, pacifying regions, and basically establishing a new order. It's a bit like an epic road trip, but with more divine assistance and fewer bathroom breaks. Every obstacle he encounters, solved by supernatural intervention. Every battle, won through either a magical bird or a vague miracle. Every decision, perfect, noble, and destined. It's the kind of story that makes historians lean back, sigh, and say, "Okay, but what actually happened?" Multiple theories exist. Perhaps he was based on a real chieftain, later mythologized. Perhaps he was a composite of several leaders woven together into one divine figure, or perhaps he was entirely fabricated to give early emperors a shiny origin story with religious legitimacy. What remains is the ambiguity. A king trapped halfway between myth and memory. Jimmu's case is a reminder that history often begins as storytelling, and sometimes the line between myth and monarchy is intentionally blurred until nobody can untangle it again. The enigma continues. Even today, Emperor Jimmu remains a symbol rather than a historical certainty. His legacy is celebrated in Japanese culture, and his supposed mausoleum is maintained with full imperial respect, despite the slightly awkward fact that we don't know if he was real, kind of real, or entirely legendary. He's like the historical version of that friend you vaguely remember from elementary school but can't picture clearly, except he's the founding emperor of a major world civilization. So Jimmu stands as one of history's softest mysteries, a king whose story shaped a nation, even if the man himself might be more myth than monarch. Now let's slowly drift away from the sunlit myths of ancient Japan and return to the shadowy corridors of documented history, to a king whose secrets are wrapped not in legend, but in political paranoia, coded letters, and an unhappy marriage that really could have used couples counseling. Part 3. King Christian II of Denmark. The brooding king who trusted no one. Right. Let's gently drift out of mythology and float back into a world of letters, court politics, sad royal dinners, and a king who managed to alienate basically everyone except the one woman he wasn't supposed to love. Tonight we're sliding into the chilly royal atmosphere of King Christian II of Denmark, a monarch whose life reads like a long, slow-burning political tragedy with just enough mystery to keep historians squinting centuries later. Christian II ruled during the early 1500s, a time when Europe was busy stressing about religion, money, and whichever neighbor had the bigger cannons. And while some rulers tried to manage these tensions with diplomacy or charisma, Christian decided to handle things by, well, alienating his nobility, provoking foreign powers, clinging to a doomed relationship, and writing way too many emotional letters. His reign is one of those stories where you want to pat the king on the shoulder and say, "Buddy, please. Just stop doubling down." So let's drift softly into Christian's melancholy little saga. A prince raised by tension. Christian was born into the Kalmar Union, a Scandinavian political arrangement that, in theory, united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one crown. In practice, it was more like a dysfunctional group project where everyone resented each other and nobody wanted to do the work. Christian grew up with overbearing nobles' endless political pressure, sense that Sweden might revolt any minute, and a deeply fractured relationship with his parents. Basically, he was raised inside a stress casserole. He learned early on that trust was dangerous. He also learned that nobles were annoying. And unfortunately for everyone involved, these lessons shaped his entire approach to ruling. Christian came of age sensitive, reactive, and quietly resentful, a man who could never quite relax into the role he'd inherited. He married Isabella of Austria, a Habsburg princess, which in the early 1500s was like marrying into the Marvel Cinematic Universe of political families. Isabella was sweet, devoted, and entirely unprepared for the chilliness awaiting her in Denmark. The nobles disliked her Habsburg influence. The court disliked her foreign ways. And Christian, well, he was politely affectionate but not much more. Because Christian's real emotional focus lay elsewhere. Dybvik. The love that ruined everything. Christian's heart belonged to Dybvik Sigbritsdatter, a young Dutchwoman who was absolutely not of royal status and absolutely not acceptable to the Danish nobility. Dybvik was gentle, educated, and by most accounts refreshingly normal, which might explain why Christian fell for her with a sort of quiet desperation. She was a calm in his stormy personality, a refuge from court politics, a person who didn't treat him like a political asset. But having a low-born partner as your primary emotional anchor while you're married to a Habsburg princess, not ideal, not politically savvy, not remotely survivable. And Christian made it worse by elevating Dybvik's mother, Sigbrit Willems, to a high administrative position, giving her immense influence over commerce and finance. The nobles hated that. The clergy hated that. Everyone hated that. Christian. He shrugged and continued inviting Dybvik to official events, which is honestly impressive levels of royal tunnel vision. Dybvik's sudden death. Then came the turning point, the mystery at the center of Christian's life. In 1517, Dybvik died suddenly after eating cherries at a nobleman's house. Cherries. Which immediately caused a wildfire of rumors that she'd been poisoned. Christian, already paranoid and fragile, spiraled. He fixated on the death, interrogated nobles, and ultimately had one of them executed, a man named Torben Ox, despite the fact that the evidence was flimsy at best. Did Ox kill Dybvik? Historians still shrug. It might have been poison. It might have been spoiled fruit. It might have been a health condition. There's no definitive answer. But Christian believed it was murder, and he never recovered from the grief or the mistrust it sparked. Dybvik's death became the central trauma of his reign, a wound that bled into his politics, his paranoia, and his increasingly erratic decisions. The Stockholm bloodbath. The moment he lost Sweden forever. Christian's relationship with Sweden had always been tense, but when he tried to assert control as king of the Kalmar Union, things went straight downhill. In 1520, Christian took Stockholm, crowned himself king of Sweden, and promised amnesty to his political enemies. Then, 3 days later, he executed around 80 of them in what became known as the Stockholm bloodbath. Now, here's the sleepy clarification. We're not going to describe violence, but we are going to quietly acknowledge the political earthquake it caused. Sweden saw Christian not as a strong ruler, but as a treacherous, vindictive tyrant who broke his own promises. The massacre, in its political sense, was a point of no return. It sparked rebellion, disintegration of the Kalmar Union, and ultimately the rise of Gustav Vasa as Sweden's new leader. And Christian. He earned himself the unflattering nickname, Christian the Tyrant, which is awkward because he'd only ever wanted control, not chaos. But that's the thing about paranoia and grief. They don't mix well with coronation oaths. A king falling apart. After the bloodbath, Christian's political support at home evaporated faster than royal goodwill in a tax crisis. The Danish nobles already hated his reliance on Dyvik's mother. They hated his emotional instability. They hated his reforms that favored commoners over aristocrats. And they hated being blamed for everything that went wrong. Christian's court slowly dissolved into a whispering circle of men who wished he'd stop making every decision based on feeling instead of strategy. In 1523, the nobles rebelled. Christian fled into exile. His uncle took the throne. It was humiliating in every possible way. The restless exile. Christian spent years wandering Europe, trying to convince someone, anyone, to help him reclaim the throne. He wrote pleading letters. He petitioned kings. He paced through foreign rooms muttering about betrayal. His wife, Isabella, loyally followed him during these wandering years. Tragically, she died young, leaving Christian emotionally adrift once more. And because history is sometimes too ironic for comfort, her death also severed his ties to the Habsburgs, the one family powerful enough to help him. He made one final attempt to recover Denmark. He sailed there in 1531, and was promptly arrested. Not the triumphant comeback he hoped for. 27 years of imprisonment. Christian spent the rest of his life locked away, first in a comfortable captivity, then in increasingly harsh confinement as the political winds shifted. His prison included a dark chamber, a narrow courtyard, single window, and long, empty years. He grew increasingly eccentric, talking to servants through doors, requesting small comforts, and occasionally attempting escape. His captors claimed he was mentally unstable. His supporters claimed he was perfectly lucid. Like so many mysteries in royal history, the truth lies somewhere in a gray, unreachable middle. Christian died in 1559 after 27 years of imprisonment, a ghost of the king he once was, tucked away in a fortress while Europe moved on without him. Why his life still feels so strange. Christian II's mystery isn't supernatural. It isn't magical. It's emotional. He's a king whose entire downfall revolves around a single love affair, a sudden unexplained death, a spiral of paranoia, and a series of decisions driven by wounded grief instead of strategy. He never stopped mourning Dyvik. He never trusted anyone again. He never escaped the shadow of his own suspicions. Historians still debate. Was he mentally ill? Was he a reformer ahead of his time? Was he a tragic, fragile man in the wrong job? Was he simply overwhelmed? We don't know. What we can say is that Christian II remains one of Europe's most enigmatic kings, a ruler whose story feels more like a slow, somber ballad than a political chronicle. His life drifts through the centuries like a faded letter, smudged with emotion, heavy with lost possibilities. And now, letting Christian's sad, snowy legacy fade into the distance, let's float quietly toward our fourth mysterious ruler, a king whose disappearance launched centuries of speculation, treasure hunts, and conspiracy theories. Part 4. King John I of England's Lost Treasure. The king who misplaced a whole crown. Right. Let's settle back down, take a long, slow breath, and drift into one of history's quieter but still delightfully baffling mysteries. This one involves a king who managed to do what few monarchs have ever done: lose an entire royal treasure. Not a pouch of coins. Not a chest of valuables. An entire state treasury. Poof. Vanished into thin air, or mud, technically. So tonight, we wander into the dreary, rain-soaked world of King John I of England, the man best known for irritating literally every social class, arguing with the Pope, getting bullied into signing the Magna Carta, and famously being, well, not the sharpest arrow in the royal quiver. John ruled from 1199 to 1216, and his reign is so thoroughly documented as being disappointing that even his nickname, Lackland, feels like medieval people collectively roasting him across centuries. But among all the questionable decisions John made, and trust me, the man was practically a walking questionable decision, nothing stands out quite like the mystery of the lost crown jewels. A royal disappearance so bewildering that historians still shrug and say, "We honestly don't know where they went." So let's sink into the foggy marshlands of early 13th century England and watch this mystery unfold slowly, like a medieval disaster in soft focus. John, the king who inherited problems and then made more. Before we get to the treasure, let's gently glide through John's general vibe. Spoiler, it's not great. John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, which sounds glamorous until you remember that growing up in that family was kind of like growing up in a soap opera where everyone had trust issues and a habit of starting rebellions at family dinners. His brothers overshadowed him. Richard the Lionheart, who got all the heroic Pierre Geoffrey, who was charming and scheming Henry the young king, who had the looks and the legacy. John. He was intelligent, petty, suspicious, stubborn, and unlucky. Not necessarily in that order. He also had a reputation for micromanaging everything and trusting no one, which is a fun personality trait if you're an accountant, but less fun if you're running a kingdom. Throughout his reign, John spent most of his time losing land to the French, taxing people into emotional collapse, annoying the church, getting excommunicated, and misreading situations with the precision of a man who definitely did not pass the medieval equivalent of political science 101. He wasn't evil, just deeply, profoundly impractical. And that impracticality eventually led him, and his royal treasure, into one of history's muddiest mysteries: the slow march into trouble. In the final year of John's reign, England was in a state of near constant rebellion. The barons hated him. The church barely tolerated him. Foreign envoys considered him a liability wrapped in a crown. John spent these months racing across his kingdom trying to keep control, which meant lots of traveling, lots of baggage wagons, and lots of chaotic decision-making. He was constantly on the move, sleeping in random castles, fording rivers, and generally acting like a royal nomad in crisis. By autumn of 1216, John had caught dysentery, the least glamorous disease possible, and was stumbling through the eastern marshlands while attempting to escape rebellious forces. This is where the story gets blurry and muddy, very muddy. The disappearance of the crown jewels. On or around October 12, 1216, John's baggage train attempted to cross the Wash, a tidal estuary with the charming habit of swallowing people, horses, carts, and dignity. The exact details are lost to time, but the general consensus is this. The tide came in. The carts got stuck. And the entire royal treasure, chests of gold, silver, jewels, relics, and royal regalia, vanished into the sucking mud. Just gone. To visualize this, imagine your moving truck falling into a swamp. Now multiply the value by several kingdoms. And add the humiliation of being king while it happens. John wasn't present at the crossing, which is classic John honestly. But when word reached him, it hit like a medieval panic attack. His treasure wasn't just personal wealth. It held the royal regalia, the items that symbolized the monarchy itself. Losing them meant losing legitimacy. And losing legitimacy was the one thing John could not afford. Aside from, everything else he couldn't afford. Was it really lost? Here's where historians get fussy. Some think the treasure genuinely sank into the marsh. Some think it was stolen. Some think chroniclers exaggerated or invented the whole thing. Some think the treasure was partially recovered but quietly covered up. The problem is that we have no recovered treasure, no clear eyewitness accounts, no archaeological confirmation, no written record from John himself. He was too busy dying of dysentery. And the Wash has shifted so dramatically over 800 years that if the treasure is still down there, it's buried under meters of silt, and also several centuries of wishful thinking. John's last days. After the treasure incident, John deteriorated quickly. His illness worsened. His emotional state worsened. His appetite worsened in a spectacular way. He ate far too many peaches and drank far too much cider, which, shockingly, did not improve the dysentery. He died on October 19, 1216, only a week after the treasure vanished. It was a miserable, undignified end to a miserable, undignified stretch of rule. The kind of end that medieval chroniclers wrote about with an odd sense of smugness. John's 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited a kingdom in rebellion, a war in progress, and a monarchy missing its symbolic jewelry. Talk about inheriting problems. Why the mystery endures. People love lost treasure stories. They love hidden gold, secret chests, ancient royal relics waiting under the mud. But this one has endurance for a different reason. Because it doesn't just raise the question, where did the treasure go? It also raises, did the event even happen the way we think it did? And that ambiguity is delicious. Soft, foggy, unresolved. A perfect example of medieval record keeping at its most dramatic and least reliable. Let's quietly sift through the main theories. Theory 1. The treasure sank and is still there. This is the classic version. The baggage wagons got stuck in the tide, were swallowed by quicksand like mud, and disappeared forever. Some believe the crown jewels lie somewhere under. Shifting sandbanks, buried marshland, tidal mud layers, and centuries of geographic change. Archaeologically speaking, recovering the treasure would be like trying to locate a single spoon lost in a bowl of oatmeal, while the bowl keeps changing shape. To date, no significant treasure has been found in the wash. But that doesn't stop treasure hunters from searching. Quietly, optimistically, sometimes with metal detectors and far too much enthusiasm. Theory 2. The story was exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers had a flair for dramatization, especially when writing about kings they disliked. And John. Oh, they disliked him very much. The political spin might have gone like this. John fell ill and died. Kingdom needs a scapegoat, chroniclers say. He even lost the royal treasure. The story goes viral by 13th century standards. Makes sense. Plus, no royal regalia from that period has been definitively identified as missing. Some may have been recreated quietly. Some may never have existed in the first place. The silence in official records is suspiciously convenient. Theory 3. The treasure was stolen. This theory suggests that John's baggage train was attacked or looted, and the accidental drowning story was a cover-up. Pros. Theft was common. Rebels and opportunists were everywhere. Stolen treasure could easily vanish into private hoards. No scavenged items have surfaced, and no chronicler mentions a theft. And covering up a royal robbery would have required cooperation from people who despised each other. Still, it's possible. Theory 4. John made it up. This is the spiciest and most absurd theory, but also very on-brand for John. It argues that John staged the loss or exaggerated it to gain sympathy, conceal mismanagement, or cover the fact he'd already spent or pawned much of the treasure. Do we have evidence? Not really. But does it sound like something John might do? Absolutely. What we know for sure. After 800 years, we can say confidently, something happened in the Washington. John's treasure was involved. The details are missing. And nobody has found the royal hall since. Which means the lost treasure remains one of England's quietest mysteries. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a gentle, persistent question mark drifting through medieval history. John himself lingers in the background of this story like a tired, slightly damp figure muttering, "I didn't mean for this to happen." And honestly, that's the most John thing imaginable. Now that we've wandered through muddy marshlands and watched an entire royal fortune vanish into the earth, let's float gently toward our final mysterious king, a ruler whose entire existence feels like a riddle wrapped in gold leaf and incense. Part 5. Prester John, the king who never existed but wouldn't go away. Tonight's last mystery is a gentle one. The kind of mystery that feels like a dream someone had in the Middle Ages and then accidentally shared with the entire continent. A mystery not of disappearance or intrigue, but of longing. A mystery built from hope, imagination, confusion, and an enormous amount of creative geographical guessing. We end with Prester John, the king-priest of a kingdom so wondrous, so wealthy, so impossibly perfect that it became the most persistent non-existent place in history. He never lived. He never ruled. He never wrote letters full of miracles. He never sent envoys to Europe. He never built a golden palace or a river of jewels or a land where no sin could thrive. But people believed he did. For almost 500 years, Europeans searched for this king, across deserts, mountains, oceans, and belief systems. They wrote to him, prayed about him, dreamed of allying with him, invented entire geographies to place him somewhere, anywhere in the world. Prester John is a fantasy that became a diplomatic matter, a fiction that became a political hope. A myth that wandered so far into reality that real kings sent real expeditions to meet a man who only ever existed on parchment. And somehow that makes him the perfect final king in our journey. A king made of wishes, uncertainties, and quiet human yearning. Let's enter his story softly, like stepping into a half-remembered legend. The world that needed Prester John. To understand this mystery, we need to settle into the medieval mindset for a moment. A world where maps were mostly guesswork, travel beyond 100 miles felt heroic, religions shaped politics, identity, and fear, and the edges of the known world were filled in with creatures that were definitely made up. Europe between the 11th and 13th centuries was tense, fractured, and nervous. There were crusades, rival empires, and a constant sense that Christianity was beleaguered and surrounded. News traveled slowly, rumors traveled quickly, and fantasies traveled even faster. It was in this anxious, uncertain atmosphere that whispers began to drift into Europe. There is a Christian king far to the east who commands a vast, wealthy, powerful kingdom. His name is Prester John. He wasn't just a Christian king. He was the Christian king, the one who would tip the cosmic balance. Europe imagined him as a priest and monarch in one wise, just, pious, ruling a land where miracles were commonplace, commanding armies of faithful warriors, powerful enough to defeat Islam from the east while Europe attacked from the west. He was, in short, the embodiment of medieval wish fulfillment. A geopolitical fantasy dressed as a savior. But where did he come from? The answer is, nowhere. And also, everywhere. The letter that launched 400 years of searching. Around 1165, a remarkable document began circulating across Europe. A letter supposedly written by Prester John himself. It was addressed to the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. The letter described John's kingdom in such glowing, impossible terms that any modern reader instantly recognizes it as fantasy. But to the medieval mind, it was just plausible enough to inspire awe. The letter claimed rivers filled with precious stones, a fountain of youthlands without sin, monstrous beasts living in harmonia, palace built of emerald and amethyst, and a population entirely free from corruption. It was basically a medieval travel brochure written by someone who had never seen a map and had an overactive imagination. But Europeans believed it. They copied it. They translated it into dozens of languages. They cited it in serious diplomatic exchanges. The letter became one of the most influential pieces of fiction in history. Not because it was convincing, but because people desperately wanted it to be true. Prester John was the king the world needed, not the king that existed. Where is this king supposed to be? This is the part of the mystery that gets quietly humorous. Because no one had any idea where Prester John lived. And so, for centuries, people played the world's most misguided game of Where's Waldo? But with a fictional king and an entire planet. Stage 1. He's in India. Early on, Europe assumed Prester John lived somewhere in India. Important note. Medieval India was not India. It was basically whatever lands exist east of Persia that we don't understand. India was a vague conceptual direction rather than a place. For nearly 200 years, Europeans confidently asserted that Prester John lived in India, but also Persia, but also maybe Central Asia, but also near the Nestorians, but also perhaps beyond the Gobi Desert. Maps featured charming labels like, "Here dwelleth Prester John," placed randomly like a medieval cartographer shrugging creatively. But as exploration improved, and Europeans began arriving in Asia, something awkward happened. No one could find him. So they adjusted. Stage 2. He's in Central Asia. Genghis Khan's empire exploded across the continent in the early 13th century. And suddenly, Europeans heard about powerful rulers, strange tribes, and vast armies. This renewed optimism. Maybe one of these Mongol kings is Prester John. At least a dozen real people were temporarily identified as Prester John, including Togrul, the Karait Khan, Genghis Khan's allies, random tribal leaders who had never heard of Europe. This confusion led to bizarre diplomatic attempts, including letters addressed to Prester John, being delivered to thoroughly baffled Mongol officials. Eventually, the illusion collapsed. The Mongols were clearly not Christian savior kings. So the myth migrated again. Stage 3. He's in Ethiopia. By the 14th century, Europe had discovered an actual Christian kingdom. Ethiopia, home to rulers of the Solomonic dynasty who openly practiced Christianity. This felt like destiny to Europeans. Of course, Prester John was here the whole time. Never mind that. Ethiopians had never heard of him. Their culture bore no resemblance to the myth. They politely informed Europeans that no, their king was not named John, and no, they did not have rivers of gems. But Europe insisted anyway, with a sincerity that probably caused mild diplomatic headaches in Addis Ababa. For nearly 200 years, Europeans confidently wrote about Prester John, the king of Ethiopia, while Ethiopian rulers quietly tried to correct them. Didn't work. The myth was too strong. Why this king never went away? Prester John persisted not because the story was believable, but because it was comforting. He embodied several quiet desires. 1. A desire for a powerful Christian ally. Europe felt isolated and outmatched. Imagining a Christian super-king somewhere across the world was emotionally stabilizing. 2. A desire for a golden age. His kingdom was perfect, peaceful, prosperous. Everything Europe wanted and did not have. 3. A desire for order amid chaos. Medieval life was unpredictable. A wise priest-king symbolized the ideal of stability. 4. A desire for connection. Prester John represented the dream that the world was smaller, friendlier, and full of invisible allies. 5. A desire for magic. Medieval people lived in a world between reality and myth. Prester John lived in that same twilight space. And above all, 6. Humans love stories too much to let them die easily. Once a myth settles into the cultural imagination, it's nearly impossible to uproot. Prester John was a fantasy that felt good. So he became real in every way except existence. The quiet end of the myth. By the 17th century, global exploration had mapped the world well enough that there were no unknown regions left large enough to hide a mythical priest-king with a gem-filled river. Slowly, reluctantly, Europe accepted that Prester John did not exist. He faded not with a dramatic revelation, but with a gentle sigh, the way a childhood fantasy disappears when the light grows brighter. But what makes Prester John unique is this. Even though he was never real, he shaped real history. He motivated explorers, he influenced diplomacy, he shaped cartography, he fueled the age of discovery, he colored Europe's imagination for centuries. His myth merged with political hopes, fears, and dreams. He is the most powerful imaginary king who ever lived. A king who left no throne, no tomb, no treasure. Just a long, soft echo that still lingers around the edges of medieval history. A mystery without a solution. Unlike the other kings in this series, Prester John presents no puzzle to solve, no evidence to examine, no body to identify, no treasure to unearth. His mystery is more delicate. Why did people believe so deeply in someone so impossible? The answer lies in the quiet spaces between human fear and human hope. Prester John is the perfect ending to our journey because Tutankhamun's mystery lies in death, Atahualpa's mystery lies in betrayal, John's treasure lies in the mud. But Prester John's mystery lies in longing. He exists because people wanted him to. And sometimes that's the most enduring mystery of all. Epilogue. Drifting back from the kingdoms that never quite slept. Right. Now that we've wandered through 5 long, strange stories of kings who were tragic, unlucky, misunderstood, or completely imaginary, let's settle into a calm landing. Something gentle enough to ease you into sleep, but warm enough to tie the whole journey together. Think of this epilogue like turning down the last candle in a medieval hall. The stone walls are cooling. The embroidered tapestries are settling. And the histories we explored tonight are still echoing faintly somewhere behind us. Not loudly, but like distant footsteps in a long corridor. Let's relax into that soft quiet. All these kings with problems. When you step back and look at the 5 figures we explored, there's a funny, sleepy pattern. They're all kings who should have had it all. Wealth, prestige, palaces, gilded robes, armies, influence. And yet every one of them came with a heavy personal footnote that overshadowed their power. Tutankhamun, the fragile boy buried in golden splendor, remembered more for his tomb than his actual life. Atahualpa, victorious in a civil war only to be undone by strangers he underestimated. John of England. So dramatic, insecure, and disastrous that even his treasure decided to disappear into the mud out of second-hand embarrassment. Christian II, the brooding Scandinavian king who couldn't let go of love or suspicion, and ended up spending half his life imprisoned in a castle tower. And Prester John, the king who never existed but still managed to influence centuries of exploration because people liked the idea of him too much to let him go. 5 kings. 5 mysteries. 5 very different shapes of human frailty. What ties them together isn't power or glory. It's how profoundly human their stories are. Soft, flawed, confused, full of stumbles, hopes, and long shadows. Even Prester John, the imaginary one, represents a kind of shared human vulnerability. The desire to believe there's someone out there who has it all figured out. Kings or not, they all lived in worlds filled with uncertainty. Just like everyone else. The soft thread running through them all. If you listen closely, and we're talking bedtime level closely, each king's story has the same quiet whisper underneath. Nothing about power protects you from being confused or lonely. Tutankhamun's childhood was a swirl of court politics he had no control over. Atahualpa won a war only to be cornered by a force he didn't recognize. John ruled England yet couldn't rule his own impulses. Christian held 3 kingdoms but lost himself in grief. Prester John held an empire made of dreams and still couldn't answer a single letter. It's almost soothing in a strange way. Even people who wore crowns made of gold had absolutely no idea what they were doing half the time. Makes you feel a little better about forgetting your grocery list, honestly. Kings as sleep stories. There's something naturally sleepy about old stories of royalty. especially the ones where the excitement has eroded away and only the soft, lingering details remain. Ancient artifacts, lost treasure, lonely palaces, half-deciphered letters, legends that drift like dust motes, silent tombs, faded tapestries, unsent messages, and so many secrets swallowed by time. History becomes a kind of ocean when you read it slowly enough. The waves flatten out. The drama smooths into gentle ripples. The years turn into soft currents pulling everything quietly along. Even the tragedies mellow out. A king executed. A war ended. A crown lost. Kingdom imagined. A treasure sunken. The edges round themselves off after a few centuries, and what's left is just the faint outline, the quiet shape of what once mattered desperately to someone who lived long ago. That's what makes these stories perfect for nights like this. They're too far away to be stressful, too softened to be frightening, too old to stir adrenaline. Just gentle enough to follow without needing to stay fully awake. Like walking through the ruins of a castle in the fog. Why these kings stay with us. The mysteries surrounding these kings aren't the loud kind, not the crime documentary kind or the adventure movie kind. They're the soft kind of mysteries, the sort that linger not because they're dramatic, but because they're incomplete. They whisper instead of shout. We don't know exactly what happened to Christian II's mind in prison. We don't know where King John's treasure ended up. We don't know how much Tutankhamun understood about his own fate. We don't know if Atahualpa truly grasped the world that was collapsing around him. And Prester John. He's a question mark without a question. These are mysteries you don't solve, you just sit with them. They're cozy in their incompleteness. You can poke at them if you're curious, or let them drift past like clouds if you're sleepy. Either way, they're here to slow your mind to a gentle hum. The strange comfort of unfinished stories. Sleepy history works because the stories don't need tidy endings. Tutankhamun will always be the boy behind the mask. Atahualpa will always be the emperor caught between two worlds. John will always be the king whose treasure slipped away. Christian will always be the sad monarch with too much heart and too little trust. Prester John will always be wherever you want him to be. India, Ethiopia, the edge of a map, or nowhere at all. There's no pressure to get the story. No test at the end. No need to hold on to every detail. The facts are there but they float. History becomes a lullaby when the stakes fade away. Letting the kings fade into the dark. Now, as we close the book on these kings, imagine them sinking slowly back into the background. The golden mask of Tutankhamun dimming until only the silhouette remains, Atahualpa's final quiet moment returning to the calm of the Andes, King John's treasure settling deeper into the muddy riverbed, Christian II pacing inside his tower, the footsteps softening until they vanish, Prester John dissolving back into the mist of imagination. One by one they drift away. Not in a dramatic exit. Just gently. Like figures disappearing behind cathedral pillars as the candlelight dwindles. Their mysteries don't disappear. They simply become softer. Part of the great quilt of things we'll never fully know. And maybe that's the real reason these stories endure. Not because they're shocking, but because they're soothing reminders that even the most complicated lives eventually settle into silence. A few final quiet thoughts before sleep. If you're still awake, which honestly would be impressive at this point, Here are a few last soft reflections. History is one long tapestry woven by people who were all tired, confused, hopeful, flawed, emotional, and often in over their heads. Kings included. Queen included. Pharaohs included. Everyone included. Some ruled empires. Some lost empires. Some were remembered. Some were forgotten. Some were invented from scratch. But in the end, they were all just human beings trying to navigate their strange, unpredictable worlds. Just like you. Just like me. Just like everyone who's ever lived. So if you ever feel like you don't have everything figured out, or that life is confusing, or that you're doing your best with limited information, congratulations. You're basically a historical monarch minus the uncomfortable shoes and political baggage. History isn't distant. It's relatable in a slow, whispered way. And that's the perfect note to drift off on. Good night, travelers through time. As the night deepens and the stories settle into stillness, let your mind float away from palaces, deserts, tombs, mountains, castles, and imaginary kingdoms. Let everything soften. Let the kings fade. Let the centuries grow quiet. There's nothing else you need to remember. No facts to hold on to. No timeline to trace. Just drift. History will still be here in the morning. And so will more mysteries, should you ever want them. But for now, rest, breathe, and let the world grow very, very peaceful. Good night.